Dr. Jeffrey GARDERE is a clinical psychologist and clinical director of the psychology doctoral program and professor at Touro College of Osteopathic Medicine in Harlem, New York. Heather Reed is an assistant director of first-year engagement at Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida, which is the country's first accredited baccalaureate institution dedicated to educating neurodivergent students with attention issues and learning and thinking differences. Reed is also a Beacon graduate. SABRA TOWNSEND is the Director of Operations for the Jefferson Center for Autism and Neurodiversity in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and a founding member of Autism Sharing and Parenting in Philadelphia, and a mom to her neurodivergent son. Dr. RICHELLE WHITTAKER is an educational psychologist and parenting advisor with Providential Counseling and Consulting Services in Houston, Texas. So let's start our conversation with Dr. GARDERE. Why can a diagnosis of neurodivergence be such a daunting thing for families of color?
Well, first of all, let's be honest about it. A lot of people don't know what the term neurodivergence means. It's a relatively new term, and quite often people may see it as a disability instead of a different ability. Quite often in the Black and Brown community, we don't have some of the new information, some of the new research, some of the things that we do know about how neurodivergence can be something that can be extremely positive. They also fear that their child may be bullied for being different. And bottom line is, I think any parent, regardless of race, may see the diagnosis of neurodivergence or one of the diagnoses within that particular term as kind of being a left hook, something that they didn't really expect to happen with regard to their family.
Thank you for that. Well, Dr. Whittaker, Dr. GARDERE mentioned fear, and I do imagine that for African-American families or other people of color, learning this diagnosis does produce a modicum of fear. Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure. Yes. Just like Dr. GARDERE said, there is a fear of the unknown because there's a lack of information and resources. So what we don't know, we fear. And when we get the diagnosis, a lot of times parents are asking themselves, will my child be able to be normal? Will they be able to have friends? Will they be able to live independently? There's so many things that they aren't sure about. And so that alone in and of itself brings this level of fear because there's a lot of unknowns that come along with having this unexpected diagnosis of having a child that is different. And so I think that, of course, brings out this fear to parents until they get some more answers and some more access to resources.
Thank you. Well, Sabra, can you talk to me about what are some of the unique challenges that families of color who are rearing a neurodivergent child face?
This is an excellent question. You talk about resources. That's how our Autism Sharing and Parenting organization was started, because we were gathering resources and we wanted to make sure that they were resources that were provided to families that needed the resources, that they could talk and have an interaction with presenters. Sometimes things are presented in ways that are not particularly interactive. We wanted to make sure that there are things that people can talk about, can get answers from experts in a comfortable manner. So from a parent perspective, I think it's always important to focus on the needs of the student as opposed to what the parents want. I think it's very important to understand the IEP process. And those were topics of workshops that we had with Autism Sharing and Parenting.
All right, thank you. Well, Heather, once a family of color receives this diagnosis, what are some things that they should know?
They should know that they're not alone. Like everyone was saying, there are many groups out there that are looking to give them support and resources. And they should also know that this struggle is not only theirs, but it's also their students as well. And unfortunately, mainly it is their students who will be struggling. So they have to work together to find resolutions and also groundwork to be successful. And overall, it's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard, but you will have success here and there.
Thank you. So, Dr. GARDERE, when it comes to neurodivergence, early intervention is very, very critical. But is it even more critical for families of color? And if so, why?
Well, as we know, implicit bias and institutional racism is very real. And therefore, our kids are already at a disadvantage with regard to services that are available to them, with being diagnosed as early as possible. So when we look at the intersection between Black and being neurodivergent, then we see that it places them even more at risk for discrimination later on in life. So it's important as Black families that we get them the diagnosis and we get them the services as quickly as possible. Plus, the other thing is we know there's a stigma of discussing mental health concerns and challenges, cognitive issues, even neurodivergence in our Black communities. So the earlier that we get our children incorporated into the social fabric, if they are experiencing neurodivergence, then the earlier the normalization of their neurodivergence, and certainly the better the outcome for them to have a completely productive and unique life.
So, Dr. Whittaker, as Dr. GARDERE just pointed out, early intervention is so critical. But the paradox is that kids of color often receive late diagnoses. What's behind this?
So there are several reasons for this. One, it could be when a parent is taking their child to the doctor and they're given or asked questions about their development. If it's a first-time parent, they may not be sharing all of the things that they're seeing or not seeing because they may not know what's atypical development. And so there could be some delay in what information the parent is sharing about what their child is able to do or not to do. There also could be a cultural mismatch between the child and the doctor. So there's research to show that if the doctor is of another ethnicity and the child is Black, then there's oftentimes this misinterpretation of behaviors. And then also, if you have a male child, if you have a son, a lot of times things are attributed to gender, like, oh, he's a boy, boys do things later. So they say, well, we'll just re-examine this at a later time. So I think it's, it could be any of those three things. And then there's, a host of other things. But I think a lot of times it's the first time parent not knowing. I think it's cultural mismatch between the doctor and the family. And I also think it's gender because of gender.
All right. SABRA, let's talk a little bit about stereotypes. There's the unfortunate lingering stereotypes of Black kids as lazy, as stupid, and as bad. And then you have the model myth theory that Asian kids are whiz kids and musical prodigies. And then there are other stereotypes that abound. My question, I guess, is, how corrosive are stereotypes when it comes to helping these students find the accommodation, support, and tools they're going to need to succeed?
Well, the word that you mentioned, corrosive, absolutely. But from a parent perspective, I think it is important, again, to focus on what the student needs. I'm not saying to ignore those issues, but to focus on the student needs, to look at the IEP, to make sure that it is written well, to understand that process, and also to be clear about what's happening in these IEP meetings, to understand who is in the meeting, what role they play, what the outcome is, what the recommendations are, and also your recommendations for your son or your daughter. Often from a parent perspective, our thoughts may be set to the side. You're as equal member of the team when it comes to talking about the recommendations for what the student may need. So I'm not saying ignore some of those issues, but focus on what the issues are with the student. And one thing that I remind parents is that your student, your child, is the same person before the diagnosis as after. So it's not like there's this mythical, magical change that happens when someone is diagnosed with autism or ADHD or reading learning disability to be neurodivergent. It's now you can identify and figure out what services and what interventions can happen to help the person so that it isn't a struggle, or at least it's a different approach to how they learn, so that what they're doing the best that they can to meet whatever the requirements are, and so the services can meet their needs.
Thank you. So Heather, let's get personal for a minute. You're African American or Black, and you have a learning difference. Did you experience any of these issues growing up yourself?
Yes and no. My parents built a really great community around me with support services, tutors, and counselors to really help me feel uplifted. And then also really teaching me how to look out for certain things when it comes to certain people. So when I do feel like I'm being discriminated against, I'm able to kind of shut it down and remove them from my community in a sense, because they obviously aren't looking to support me or help me in any way. So with the teachings of my parents and my community, I'm able to really kind of go against those who are looking to discriminate against me, if that answers your question.
All right, thank you. But Dr. GARDERE, I wanted to circle back on the early intervention issue with this question. So what are some of the consequences and hardships that children of color who receive late diagnoses might face?
Well, as we know, early intervention for any kind of a medical, psychological, neurodivergent situation means a better prognosis. We want to get to the children, especially when we're talking about neurodivergence, while the brain is still changing. We want to be able to find out, as one of our great panelists talked about, what is it that the child needs? What is unique about that particular child that we can help them develop in that direction? If we don't get that, pretty much they're left on their own. And we've seen that from, a past generation where it took us so long to diagnose, for example, with being on the spectrum or some other neurodivergence, where some of the adults perhaps have not lived up to their full potential. So that, I believe, is a major issue. The other one is, we're living in a biased, as I said, and unequal system in this country. Even with the school system, we see that our kids are offered less. Black and brown children are offered less, and therefore they are at risk for less success. But I'm also concerned about the dangers in the communities in which they are growing up. We've had a major issue with police brutality. And therefore, if you have someone who's neurodivergent, are they going to be able to read the cues that may be happening in a situation where they're being pulled over, or perhaps they may manifest a behavior which is absolutely a fine, incredible behavior, but that police officer may not know how to read that particular behavior of the neurodivergent individual. And therefore, now that person may be at risk for even more danger. So those are some of the things that we see, and why it is so essential that we meet the needs of our children and make sure that they get this early intervention. It's just something that must happen for their future success.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Whittaker, research shows that children of color are more at risk for being suspended or expelled in school because behaviors that might be excused by their peers are hammered on them because they're perceived to be bad or unruly. And then there's other research that shows that children of color who have ADHD that's undiagnosed, those symptoms may be perceived as misbehavior more so than their peers. So I guess my question here is, how critical is it to deal with these issues, get these kids diagnosed so that it doesn't lead to that school to prison pipeline phenomena?
So what I've seen is a lot of times we're treating the symptoms and not getting to the root cause of the issue. For instance, when I was working in the schools providing testing to children suspected of who had a disability, a lot of times these kids who had behavior issues were put into these behavior classrooms, which I call like a mini prison. And because they were in the classroom, they weren't really being educated because everybody in the classroom was disruptive. And so no one is treating the root cause. No one is providing emotional counseling or resources for these children. They're only treating the behavior. And so what happens to uneducated Black and brown children who continue to be passed from grade to grade, who don't have skills? That just contributes to the school to prison pipeline. We see that all the time. So I think inadequate interventions by way of not dealing with the root cause, not getting the adequate diagnosis, and or the cultural mismatch, different from the student.
All right. Well, Sabra, one of the ways to kind of to stave off these negative outcomes is strong parental involvement. And when it comes to neurodivergent children, one of the cornerstones of that is a strong IEP. And you've mentioned this in our conversation. So my question is, how can parents of color prepare for the IEP meeting to make sure that their child is getting all the supports and accommodations that they require, given that they have these intersecting identities?
Well, I think one thing to start is to meet the principal, meet the counselor, meet the teacher, the special education liaison at the beginning of the school year, before an IEP meeting happens. Make sure that the evaluation team is in place. Make sure that the people make sure you understand who makes the decisions in terms of what services are provided, because an IEP is so much more than just that one. It is a legal document, but there are things that happen before the IEP and there are things that happen after the IEP. So if you know the players and you make sure that you understand who decides what, including your input, that's a good first start. Read the evaluation report. Make sure that it describes your child, your student. I've been known to take a picture. If my son wasn't involved there, generally you want your student in the IEP meeting. But if they can't be there, I've been known to take a picture to make sure that we're all talking about the same person. And then as the IEP is developed, make sure you read that, make sure you understand the testing, the scores, how things can happen in a classroom. If someone describes an intervention, ask what that looks like. You should know what an intervention looks like, and also how that can be supported when your student comes home or on the weekend. And then as they're older, in terms of transition to adulthood, transition out of the school system, there are community-based instructions that can happen. All of the instruction doesn't have to be in the physical building. In fact, special education, if they're in a special education curriculum, isn't a place. It's a service provided. And that there should be inclusive education, to the earlier point, to be in a self-contained, quote unquote, behavioral classroom, that's not an ideal setting. So if you focus on the needs of the student, then you can generally have a better outcome. And then I guess my last thought would be to know how to run a meeting. Because you are, I think of myself often as the case manager, really. When my son is long out of school, but to know how to run a meeting. That doesn't mean you take over. That doesn't mean you're bossy, but know how either you're running the meeting or know how a meeting should be run, and know all of the players that are a part of the IEP meeting. So when you get to the recommendations, when you get to what should happen, you have an understanding of what that is, and also you have a timeline on when those things are supposed to happen. And then there are assessments that happen to make sure that the interventions are actually happening. So it's a process, but it's helpful to know what the process is.
All right, well, thank you. So Heather, let's fast forward and say that we have a student that has successfully completed his K through 12 education. What are some of the issues that you are seeing from incoming freshmen who are both neurodivergent and people of color?
I'm seeing it's really being holding themselves accountable. You know, college is supposed to be fun. You're independent, you're away from home, and you're trying a lot of things out for the first time. But unfortunately, with a student of color who learns differently, you have a lot more to go when it comes to getting your support services, being accountable, and then getting help from either your professors or your TAs. You have to do all that all on your own. So when you are put up front and you no longer have that parent backing, it is really hard to really ask the right questions. You know, like she said, you know, be the leader of your meeting and know what's going on and be prepared. You'll just go in there and think that everyone already knows what's supposed to be happening, but unfortunately they don't. So you really have to know who you are as a student when it comes to your learning differences, the support services that you've used in the past, what works, what doesn't work. So you really come into your own as an adult with your learning disabilities, but you really have to hold yourself accountable and making sure you get all the things that you need to be successful.
All right. Well, this last question is for the entire panel, and I'll start with Dr. GARDERE. So, simple question. How do we make neurodivergent students of color feel comfortable in this society?
Well, I believe that very early on, we have to build on their self-esteem, letting them know that their beauty lies in their Blackness and in their neurodivergence. That is so important, that they have a different ability and not a disability, and that we reinforce and love them as much as possible for the unique qualities, cognitive abilities that they have. And finally, we have fought for so long for the integration of people of color into society, but it's time for us, number one, to educate our Black population about neurodiversity, what it is, the wonder and the beauty of it, the risks that must be addressed, and that can be addressed through as many services as we can get, the early intervention that we talked about, and supportive care through their lives, through educational careers and so on. But now we have to look at the integration of children of color with neurodiversity into our society. They are equal members, and I truly believe that they are our salvation for tomorrow because of the very unique way that they think and the incredible abilities that they have.
Thank you. Dr. Whittaker.
So I believe in the school systems that we have to embrace differences. And so that looks like having classrooms that are more inclusive of children that are neurodivergent so that they feel more comfortable being in an environment where everybody's different, but there's some level of comfort there that they're used to not being so isolated and immersed in with other kids that are more typically developing students. And so I think that that's important. And I also think educating educators about neurodivergence and bringing those children into the classroom to integrate the classroom will just, you start early, you build on that. And so when as they become adults, they don't feel they know they're different, but they don't feel different in interacting with the general population, I would say.
All right. Sabra?
So it starts early, and I'll put my parent hat on. Making sure that you presume competence, making sure that you allow for as many experiences as possible for your child, soon to be young adult, allowing them within reason, to make the type of, mistakes and errors that neurotypical folks do. I mean, none of us are perfect. We've all made our mistakes, and they learn from them and help provide the supports. But to Heather's point, as adults and in college, they have to be self-advocates. That's why I mentioned having my son at the IEP meeting, right? We're talking about you. I never talk about him in his presence without him understanding that he's being discussed, right? And he has an input to that discussion because his voice, he is the person who has the particular needs and issues. So it's helpful to presume that competence and allow them to advocate for themselves, because I'm not going to be around forever. his parents aren't going to be around to always support him, and he needs to know that and know how to support himself and know how to speak up for himself. Heather made an excellent point about advocating for the needs and knowing what the support you need and being able to ask for it. Now, here at the center, where I'm at the Center for Autism and Neurodiversity at Jefferson, we make sure that folks have the sort of experiences, interactive experiences in the community, depending on their level of ability and what they can do, so that they can advocate for themselves. And that systems know that they have to be inclusive. With the Americans with Disabilities Act, while it covers all of the disabilities and different abilities, but there are no guidelines about what needs to happen. So we need to work to improve that and make sure that there are some guidelines in terms of public accommodations, in terms of how buildings are built, in terms of how public spaces. To Dr. GARDERE's point earlier, we're currently doing a study called Safety on the Spectrum, Situational Awareness in Public Places. Because if we're going to be included, then everyone needs to understand what some of the challenges are. And definitely our first responders, our police, our fire, our rescue. So it's an ongoing effort because in terms of inclusion, neurodivergent people are across all different ethnicities, across all different socioeconomic levels, but we can't separate that from what it means to be Black in America. We have to be realistic about what that means and having our students, our children, our young adults be aware of what they can advocate for to make a better life for themselves.
All right. And Heather, you get the last word.
Perfect. I think it's really showing your student outside the classroom, showing them, where you work and what you're struggling with when it comes to your job, struggling with your community, working with your church, working with other families. You really have to show them everything. There's more to life than your learning difference, and you're going to have to balance those two out. You do have a learning difference, and you're also a person of color, and you also have to go out there into the world and be both of those things at the same time. So show your student as much as possible so they feel like they are included and that they are not left behind. That really gives them an idea that they can go further than they actually thought they could originally.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Heather. And we'll have to leave this important conversation there. Dr. Jeffrey GARDERE, Dr. RICHELLE Whittaker, SABRA Townsend, and Heather Reed. Thank you for the conversation.